You know, I think this was after Good Sen, and he talked a little bit about that book and what it, you know, he wanted to see the other sides of it, and the other voices of it, but I don't think he mentioned any of his sci-fi. I don't really know much about Butler's work. The only thing I've read is that. So but yeah, and he's not unlike, you know.
Sometimes those guys advertise about what they're doing next.
Yeah. I don't know. The one thing I think Butler shares with Jones, and unlike a lot of other war writers, is he is very concerned with sex in his novels and sensuality. Jones is too. I mean, for him, war is an entirely sexual experience, completely engrossed in the same. War is a bedroom, and I think this is what Malick does right in his film. He shows. It's actually kind of funny. On the version of this novel, they call it "The Lusty, Brutal New Novel of Combat" by James Jones, which I love. But you know, and that helps to explain why Jones is thought of as a sort of a popular author and a war writer. But I don't think that's an unfair characterization. This is a lusty novel. I mean, and war is a lusty place. You know, I mean, war is where passions come out. I mean, soldiers cry a lot. It's just the way war works. I mean, I don't know why that is, but you see a lot of stoic depictions of it. And yeah, I mean, it's just from what I know, that's not the case. I think Jones captures that, and Butler too, from what I've read of him. Any other questions? Yeah.
I really like that you want to call him a writer instead of a warfighter. And I'm always suspicious of those labels when a writer is categorized as a something writer.
Right.
To me, that means whoever gave them the label wants them out, wants them on the margin, doesn't want them. And I was talking with Kaylee about this, that he was a Midwesterner who had never gone to college, and he wrote this fiction from a perspective that perhaps Red Badge of Courage is the closest perspective in terms of American literature, but there were people who didn't want to read about a real experience from a soldier who could really write. He was a threat to a lot of the status quo, so calling him a war novelist was a good way of kind of dismissing him. And I think you're right. He's a writer.
Yeah. I mean, he did definitely get pigeonholed in that category.
And he didn't call him, you know, when somebody else gives you a name, always be careful.
Yeah.
Right? If you're not naming yourself, if somebody else is calling you something, you're in trouble.
Well, and you know, there are general questions about what it means to categorize a writer within a genre. Certainly, that applies in many cases, whether it's used derisively or has some value, I don't know. A writer I like is Cormac McCarthy, who I tend to think of as a Western writer, maybe a Gothic writer, and I don't think that's necessarily degrading. I mean, I think it sums up the sort of the underlying horror of his fiction. But
probably if he had named, you know, he may call himself that, but James Jones did not call himself a war writer.
Right.
That was a name prescribed to him by somebody else. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I at some point I'm planning to write a dissertation on Jones, and I would like to sort of study the way he's been treated over the years by the critics, because it is a real case study in sort of the establishment or the literary academia versus a writer who tried to see things as he saw them. And that's not to say Jones was always outside the establishment by any stretch, but he was definitely in conflict with it along those lines, and you can see why. I mean, he's got a populist ideology at some points, and that's.
His most famous and maybe most lionized novel, Mere Eternity, is not really a war novel.
Yeah. But it's been framed as that, I think, since his death. And the question is why? I mean, what sort of project does that serve? And I think what you're saying is true. It does sort of dovetail him or put him in the category of that subject. But I think the other thing is that Jones, war today is very different in the sense that soldiers choose to fight there, by and large, in the Western armies at least. And in Jones's time, they didn't. And it might help to explain why nowadays, when we think of war fiction, we think of soldiers, we think of them as a separate category or a separate species almost, those who go off to war. And that helps to explain, I think, why Jones is seen the way he is, as one of those war writers. And in Jones's time, everybody was connected to the war, at home, abroad. I mean, it was just a different era. Soldiers were not a type per se. There is obviously that, but but it wasn't a species of human the way it is now. And I think that explains, in part at least, why Jones is thought of as being, you know, a lusty, brutal writer of combat. You know? Yeah.
I can ask you the same question I asked Winston Groom. Has Jones's prose affected the way in the novel you've just written or working on?
Yeah, I mean, mine, I structured it completely along the lines of the Thin Red Line, right down to the company roster on the opening pages. I think that's just, I think it's great. I mean, but in terms of his sentence style, I think you have to be from a small town in the Midwest and grow up on a farm to really write sentences the way Jones does, you know, with the conciseness and a brevity and a clarity. But I unfortunately had a college education and I've grown up reading the writers that Jones would disdain, so I wouldn't compare myself to Faulkner, but my language probably is a little more winded and, you know, not quite on Jones's level. But maybe yours too, I don't know. This is the burden of academia. But the other thing I was going to say is, despite the fact that Jones didn't go to college, he worked hard he read everything. I mean, all the great war books that I'm just going through now, you know, Remarque, Heller, well, later Heller, but, you know, all the classics, Dos Passos, Hemingway, Ford, you know, those were, and Thomas Mann was, from what I understand, Jones's favorite growing up, which is, you know, it's not exactly Harry Potter. Yeah.
But he was the smartest of the rest of them. He read more than a lot of the critics and the publishers. But he was, you know.
He wasn't a member of the literary club, but at the same time, he really.
I mean, his friends were all writers.
Yeah, I mean, he was.
But the institutional.
Yeah. He was an outsider, but at the same time, he was, you know, he was profiled in the Paris Review, and the interview that Chris read. I mean, he's.
Which, as I'm thinking, is why they wanted to call him Warman.
Yeah, and I think the question is why. You know, why would the establishment use him as the token war writer? What sort of caused that? And the fact that he didn't go to college and was from a Midwest and was perceived to be stupid, you know, that's a real historical question there that I think needs to be answered.
I think it helps sales. If you trying to sell your novel, you're going to sell it as a war novel, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
is there a title?
Yeah, there is. It's actually from that line. It's called "The Sound in the Truck" at Aleda, and it's sort of a homage to Faulkner and Jones, I think. Do you have any other questions about Jones or maybe his impact? Anything at all? Okay. Well, thank you for listening.
Thank you.